Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Unearthing with Sue, my lovely researcher for the M Word, and myself, Lavinia, founder and director of the M Word. Today we've got a rather interesting one. Well, they're all interesting, aren't they, Sue? They're all interesting. Yes. But today I am telling you now that there was so much in this, Sue and I felt that it was better to divide it into two programs. So we're going to do the first half today and then complete the program next week in and around friendships. So, Sue, over to you.
Thank you. And just a quick header is I have realized that, our Wi-Fi issue last week was a little bit of a blip, and hopefully it's not going to happen again today. But thank you to everybody who stuck with us if you did manage to complete watching the program. Yes, and I wasn't on best form, but yes, that's just a little caveat because I had that unpredictable event, which
you did very well.
Yes. So today, friendship is our theme, and it is such a theme that we can't quite squash in as much as we would like into this hour. And I thought I'd begin with what friendship actually is, and this is how my process goes: is that I picture a word in my head and I think about the elements that might affect it, a bit like a spider web in my head. And I sometimes just Google the odd words. And what came up when I first Googled friendship was Aristotle, the ancient philosopher. And he said all those many moons ago in his wisdom that there are three kinds of friendships. And he categorized them as such: those that are good, and that can mean that they are mutual, that there is respect and admiration between the two. There are utilitarian friendships, and that can mean that these people are useful to you.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there are the pleasure friendships, which is self-explanatory, those whom we happen to enjoy company with.
Nice. Okay.
And this led me on to thinking that, that all makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And how in modern society, living in 2022 as we do, modern friendships can take very many forms now, thanks to the internet.
Yeah.
And how there is this whole social media enterprise based around friendships. That's why Facebook was set up, was to connect people together, and how that's really impacted friendships, and probably for the better for the autistic community, because it's put people in touch with each other that they wouldn't normally be in touch with. If you think when we were children, obviously minus technology, I'm not trying to give away our ages, but when we were children, it was very much about who you lived near, who you went to school with, what your parents did. So maybe there was a weekend community at church, for example. And so those friendships tended to be formed in one of those settings. And today, that is not so crucial, is it? You can be friends with somebody on the other side of the world via technology. So I thought, yes, I recognize what Aristotle was getting at in lots of ways. I think of my friends like that, not using those words of utilitarian and good, but certainly I have friends who I know I can turn to for advice, and friends that I know are good for a night out, and friends that I know are loyal and have been through thick and thin with me. So I think this is so important to get across for our families in the M-word community, that yes, although friendships are a really tricky thing for our young people, especially to establish, to maintain, to find that pleasure, that can be something that we can look at for ourselves, as in, you know, what is it I want from friendships? And you know, friendships can be very different for any individual.
Mm.
Are you lost in thought there? I've lost you.
I was just thinking about the fact that apart from the fact that I'm dyslexic and autistic and trying to get my head around you see I'm already struggling.
Utilitarian.
Utilitarian. Oh dear me. They are very valuable in that they are clumped together in a group that is really easy to discern, is it not? And I quite like that, because it's you know, when we think about our friendships, particularly when we are starting out, you know, as a child, we don't see it in that way. We just see it as you need to go out and play with your friends. Well, how do you discern your friendships? It's only as adults you kind of really appreciate the different needs that you have. You know, we assume that friendships are all about, you know, being engaging, going out, socializing, attending parties, social events, don't we? So the very fact that we've now got the possibility of thinking about friendships in different ways as adults is hugely helpful to help us with our children, really, which I think is extremely helpful within the autistic community.
Yeah, and there is this huge pressure that comes from social media, in inverted comma, friendships. You know, when you see these numbers against people's names and profiles, you know, oh, such a body has got 5,000 friends, you know, like, wow. But out of those friends, are they really, truly friends?
Yeah.
You know, are they people who will drop everything for you if you're in a crisis, for example? Are they someone who will show up for you if you say, let's make a date, let's go out?
Yeah,
you know, and that's perhaps made it easier for some, and not so easy for others. You know, there's this superficiality to it, which can really impact the autistic, the forming young person, you know, in all their autisticness. You know, that's why it's quite a minefield.
Okay. Do you want me to move to the next slide then? Communication.
Yes, so communication, it's a big one, of course, because if we think about what defines autism, which is very difficult and contentious in itself, but if we think about the formal way of diagnosing, for example, autism, communication are markers that distinguish the autistic brain from the non-autistic brain. The person with autism can present very differently, and social communication, social interaction are key factors in that diagnosis. And that's what clinicians would look at. You know, how does this person communicate? How does this person respond in communication? What style of communication? You know, how do they interact? And communication is the foundation of friendship. That's why it's number one here, because, you know, without communication, friendships just wouldn't happen. And it is about making ourselves understood. And as we know in the autistic community, that is super, super challenging for our young people to be understood. And the styles of communication can present very differently to the norm. I mean, I always do these little finger inverted commas because, what is normal communication anyway? And I was particularly struck thinking about this, listening to a podcast called 1800 Seconds on Autism. And there's two very wonderful young people that run this podcast, and they were talking about their different styles of communicating. Poppy, who's a young woman, she says about being easily overwhelmed, and she can get so nervous that she becomes echoalic, where she might just repeat back what people say to her and get a bit of a stammer about it. And, she can sort of feel that she loses her words. And Jamie, the other person presenting the podcast, he said about times when he's so distressed and overwhelmed, he can completely lose his words. And that, those among us in the professional fields would call this mutism, either selective, which is the traditional old-fashioned way of calling it, selective mutism.
Like we have a choice.
Yeah, like we have a choice, not. So the preferred term is situational. Yeah. And Jamie would say, he's an incredibly articulate young man, and the podcast is really worth a listen because they're so funny and they just have this great way of explaining things. And he said, there's times when I'm just without words. There are times when the sensory input can totally overwhelm. And also when, the stress is so high, I just cannot, form words, or I might lose the words in my head, and then it might become important to use other means of communicating. So it's always a reminder to me that I'm very privileged in my ability to be able to communicate articulately most of the time. I mean, I have my moments where I just become a flabbergasting wreck, where I can't quite find the word that I'm looking for, and one of those moments where you're just like, I've got the word on the tip of my tongue, and you just can't bring it to the front of your brain. So that happens a lot for me. But I'm very privileged in that I can write and articulate it fairly clearly, depending on my executive function.
I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I know myself that I tend to go very quiet when I'm really lost for words. I just can't. And when I also get very, very anxious, I shut down, and it's whatever needs to function the most, usually your heartbeat, that you can hear most of. And I know that from the outside perceptions of others that there is this expectation that I speak a lot and therefore I am able to articulate, but even to the point of not even being able to think about, well, I could write it down or I could show. I just can't. I just shut down, and it's very frustrating for sure. Very frustrating. So okay.
Yeah. Oh, we've
this seems a very appropriate statement. Have I?
Yes, and I haven't mentioned where I got the idea for today's episode. So basically, when I'm doing a Google, I look for keywords, and Ambitious About Autism is an organisation here in Britain who support young people and is run by Autistics, and they have a youth participation team, which is fantastic. They're all autistic, and they do a blog every now and again. And this one I found fairly recently, which was 10 reasons autistic people can struggle with friendships. And this was done back in 2016, but I thought it's just so clear that I thought we'd follow it. And I've also looked around, as I do, gathering my information into the books that I have and onto the social media stuff, as well as looking at proper research. But I thought next week I will come back to more official research studies, if you like. And this is more today about relating experiences of autistic authors, because, I love a good book, and I have lots of books, and I often go straight to a book, and call me old-fashioned, but hey. And just before I move on, I've got this fantastic quote from Chris Packham's wonderful book, Fingers in the Sparkle Jar. Chris Packham should be a renowned name for most people, the man who is often on our telly talking about wildlife. And he very beautifully wrote about his experiences through his childhood and teenage years in this book, and he reflects on them. So I'm going to read from it now. In secondary school, I spoke almost all the time, but I couldn't really talk. I tried a few times, but they told me I was talking too fast, that it was boring, that I was a divvy. So I suppose in the end, I gave up. And what hit me from that little section was the wonderful line that he spoke all the time, but he couldn't really talk. And that really caught me. And I knew exactly what he meant, because there's times where I think we're so desperate to have that connection, aren't we?
Yeah.
And so desperate to get our point across or to share something. That's the whole point of talking, is to share. And it depends on the audience, and it depends on the time and the place, and it depends on the person that you're talking to as to whether they get it or not.
Yeah. Do you want me to move on?
Yours.
Okay.
So yes.
Where did you get this phrase from then? Minefield of navigation. This is really lovely.
Yeah, well, this is what just occurred to me, really, in this whole system of being a human being, a social animal. That there are all these rules, and to a lot of autistic advocates, they say, when they start school, suddenly there is this whole other rule set, of, okay, I know I should have friends. I know I probably need to have friends. Going out onto the playground. Who do I go to? How do I do it? It becomes this, I don't know. Well, minefield.
Yeah.
You feel like you've got to dodge so many elements in order to get it right. And it is about, finding those communication styles, isn't it? Trying to make some sort of connection. And the neurotypical version of things can be very different to the autistic framework. And I really like what somebody said, and I wrote it down, but sadly didn't write down who said it, that it's like we have a different frame of reference. And that is lovely. That is perfect for me. A different frame of reference, that it's almost like, some of us are Apple Macs, and some of us are Microsoft.
Yeah.
That there is this different processing going on, this different outlook, and we don't innately have the skills in place. And school is that, is that minefield you know, when a young person first has to forage for friends, mainly, isn't it? You know, school, and it can be a real confusion, I think. This is what I hear a lot, you know, within the autistic community, that, you know, some of our young people can feel really isolated and they haven't got friends, but they don't really know why they haven't got friends. And is it something I said? Is it something I did? You know, maybe they've had a big falling out at school and they come home and they're pretty upset and, you know, can't quite get to the bottom of what's causing the upset. And it turns out to be that something has happened with a friend. Most times, you know, 9 times out of 10, it'll be to do with friendships. And they don't really get it. You know, they might think, okay, well, this is what I said, but why was that bad? You know, there is this element of saying it how it is. I think, you know, within the community, we recognize that there is this directness, and that can come across as bluntness and rudeness.
Yes.
And I know certainly with my boy, one of my boys, he's very aware now, now that he's a teenager, that, you know, there were things that he said when he was little that did come out wrong, you know, that, or sorry, he was direct and very honest. And there is this saying, you know, brutally honest.
Yeah.
That, you know, whoever that was aimed at could be pretty upset. And but he didn't get it. So
a phrase that springs to mind quite often is when you have visitors enter the house, the first question as they enter is, how long are you staying for?
Yeah.
Or when are you going? Not meaning, you know, could you do an about turn and just off, but more, how long have we actually got your company for? It is interesting how we do and say things. And I was thinking also as well that and I'm sure we will cover this in another program, but some of our children are very sensory seeking, and so they don't appreciate that others are not sensory seeking. So when we're thinking about personal space and we're thinking about being touched, there is, you know, each to their own. That in itself is a bit of a minefield, because sometimes we sensory seek and want to squeeze all our friends and touch all our friends, or stand literally on top of them. And it's not reciprocated in any way, shape or form. And that, from a neurotypical person trying to reflect that back without trying to hurt somebody's feelings, doesn't compute with us autistic individuals at all. Sometimes it needs to be almost as blunt, said back to us, like, you are literally standing on top of me and I don't like it. But even that doesn't always compute, does it? So for that as an example, you can begin to understand how difficult it is when, you know, we're trying to understand why what we say and what we do is not acceptable, and people don't have the confidence to say, you know, what's causing so much distress or, you know, upset, as it were. And then there is that sense of, why are we different? But we can't really articulate that, can we? That's quite challenging in itself, isn't it?
Well, we don't actually know. When we're little, when we're young, certainly going through the junior years, we don't actually know that we're different. You know, we only know what we know, don't we?
Yes. And
we're building on that experience. You know, when we've come from the cocoon of home, you know, where you've had your parents' full attention, to this world where, you know, do you want that attention or not? Do you want to give that attention to somebody? And that can be a very focused attention when it happens, you know. But certainly in the run of our going through this list of 10 reasons to struggle. That's coming up next week, about being over friendly and a bit obsessive with one person that can get a bit, over the top. But yes, certainly the not knowing what to say or how to say it can be that, you're trying desperately to fit in with one particular person or group. And we can be very observant, and so it might be that they have a particular style about them. They might be doing a particular activity, like, it might be the footballers, who are always kicking about a ball. It might be the gang of girls who are always dancing and singing songs. And so you might think, oh, yeah, I'd quite like to join them. So you try and sort of adapt as you're going along. And lots of adult autistic advocates will say, there was so much of trying to fit in. I have this book that's written for women and girls with autism by Sarah Hendrickx, and she basically approached lots of autistic girls and women, and in this, it just really hit home to me how people have tried over and over again. One person says, I was very aware that I was different and I didn't fit in. And I had no wish to fit in, as I couldn't see what was so great about being neurotypical. And I felt rejected as my attempts to bond with peers frequently failed. And another one saying, I tried to wear the right clothes or to be interested in what other people were doing, but I never quite pulled it off. And it was like I was trying to speak in another language that I was not fluent in, and that's really clear to me that, there is this disconnect between what you're trying to do, what is the end goal, which is to fit in, but not having those tools and not having those innate thoughts. Okay, this is what I must do and say, and this is how I should be. That's a commonality.
Okay. Now, obviously, we should kind of think about the screening tool. There is always a screening tool, isn't there, to think about autism and communication. So is this a good time to go on to your social cues?
Yeah. So social cues are, you can picture a cue, if you like, a cue with a different spelling. I mean, it is a bit like that, isn't it? Well, it would be easier if it was a bit like that, if there was a cue and an order to things. So yes, it is about recognizing that there are these commonalities in the autistic population. And if you were to think as a parent, I wonder if my child has autistic traits, then there's something called the ASQ10, the autism quotient. And it's 10 points that you can think about your child if they fit or not, that statement. And the bulk of them are about social interactions and communication, such as does your child know how to keep a conversation going with peers? Does your child know that a story character has feelings and what might their intentions be? Did your child pretend play? Could your child work out what somebody else is thinking by looking at their face? And can they keep track of different conversations if they're in a group? So those are good pointers, and this is not a diagnostic tool. This is just a guideline of some of the things to look for. And that led me to think about the social cues, because there is this clear way as a human being of doing things that is multifaceted. The art of communication is not just about the words and the language. It's also about how our faces move, about our body language, as in, our expressions, our gestures. It can also be about our tone of voice. It's a very different person who's quite stern and loud, isn't it? Compared to a person who's got the gentleness and slower pace. There's lots of factors that go into helping a person pick up those cues, the pointers, if you like, to what's expected. The same as the art of conversation, knowing when to speak, if there's a pause, if there's a natural pause in the conversation, or when not to interrupt. That can be something that is very obvious with ADHD, for example, that the processing can be so fast and the young person can be so keen and enthusiastic to get out what they need to say, perhaps before they forget it, that you can go on a bit of a monologue and it can all come out in a great flurry, and then you've lost the attention of the person who's listening because you've shared so much. And also it might be that you've got a fairly monotone voice. And certainly when I was training to be a teacher, I had to really learn to pay attention to my voice for the first time. And I was told by one observer, very kindly not, that I shouted. And I just was totally unaware that I shouted. He said, just bring it back a notch. And that was I remember that very clearly, because that was like confusing, but at the same time hurtful, because, all I was trying to do was get myself across, present myself in the right way and be clear and project and, to be heard, because I'm, a class teacher in front of all these children that need to hear me. I've also been told that, it's important to think about tone in terms of being patronizing. And that is quite an abstract notion. How do you actually know if someone's patronizing you or not? Which is a tonal thing, I think.
I was just wondering as well, it's a bit like, it was a few weeks ago that you showed us just the eyes that Simon Baron-Cohen was talking about, wasn't it? And it was like, how on earth are you expected to read information from the eyes alone? But I also think about the tone, because quite often we find that autistic people can be very stilted and also very flat or robotic-like in how they speak. And that's certainly not their intention. And, for the vast majority, we're just simply not aware of it unless somebody who is very experienced in picking out tone and how you pronounce things can identify it and bring it to your attention. But generally, when we're in the flow of speech, we don't think about our voice being any different. We assume that we are talking quite normally as everybody else does. But there is also that processing that tells you how difficult and challenging it can be when you're thinking about, okay, I'm trying to listen to the tone to work out whether it's friendly or foe. In other words, is somebody being humorous with me, or are they, basically taking the piss out of me, at my expense? But also trying to think about the fact that everything when we are distressed or stressed is quite amplified. So, for you would have been certainly, I'm sure, quite stressed at trying to make sure that your voice was projected enough that children at the back of the class could hear you as well as the ones at the front. So for somebody who was, suggesting bring it down a notch when, first of all, you are the trainee teacher and you're trying to ensure that everybody can hear. That's a little unfair. But also, I think as well, when we're thinking about the choice of words that we're trying to do, if we can't read an expression, if we can't hear an expression or understand it all, because there is so much to process, we're really against the wall, aren't we? Because how do you do that? And yet, I can't help be cynical here, though, Sue. If you were on a board of directors sitting assessing a young person as to whether they're autism, do you really expect them to sit and think about the listening and about how they process the words? Because invariably, when you're sitting in front of a board, a young person might have their parents, but they don't generally have anybody else they know. It is all professionals sitting behind a desk. It's not a personal, friendly environment for them to show why the parents and other professionals might think they are being autistic. But there is so much information that you and I know about that is missed in an assessment, because simply lots of professionals and neurotypical professionals don't seem to think about listening, not only to the tone, but to also the choice of words used and the way we do it, along with our expressions. And I said to you right at the beginning, when I was seeing myself on this, I didn't realize how it's not animated at all. And you just think, we do this all the time, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is about a game of tennis. The art of picking up on those cues is about, observing, being with, interacting, and it being reciprocal and it being equal. Nobody wants to dominate a conversation, I don't think, deliberately, unless they're, I don't know, Boris Johnson. But oops. But yeah, it's a whole processing conundrum of what do I take as important, prioritize, what do I pick up upon, and like you said, the sensory input absolutely influences that, of course, as well, and it can become quite hard to focus on one thing at one time as well, that multi-processing thing going on. But yes, it isn't just about one of these things. It's everything in like an orchestra, an orchestra of people producing this symphony of music. That's the outcome, is that to have a conversation with somebody to the point where you think, yeah, we could be friends, and then to maintain that friendship by continuing to be interesting. That's a big one, isn't it? Am I interesting enough? Am I boring? There's so many times I was very sensitive to that as a kid. I was picked on a lot at school, and I was the bookworm. I was the timid one, and I was an easy target for that. But I used to really think about being interesting enough, and appealing, I think that's the female default, though, isn't it? Is to try and to blend in as well. Anyway,
I was also thinking as well, when you think about Aspergers, the communication is really quite, I don't know how else to express it, but tight. They are so focused on their interest and so rigid in their viewpoints, and that's quite difficult in thinking about that. But I was thinking about somebody who is not Asperger's ending. I'm just going to relay this little story because I just think it's quite valuable. I was working in a specialist autism school 2 years ago, and I was engaging with a young person who had not had a particularly good experience with the school, but was in the last 2 years of his education. And this particular lad was very good looking, had a girlfriend on site, but not particularly good with academia. But he portrayed the sense of, I'm okay with the world, I've got good self-esteem. And yet the vulnerability was intense underneath, but people just didn't see that. They always saw this brash lad, and he relayed to me in a conversation that his two best friends, one was Aspergers and the other one Aspergers but also ADHD. It was really quite interesting dynamics. They went to college, and he said, everybody thinks that I'm supporting my friend, my best friend. And I said, that is a very odd combination of you suggesting that he's your best friend. And he looked at me and he said, people think I'm helping him. It couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. I can look out for him because he's got not a practical bone in his body. He's got no common sense when it comes to stepping off the train and straight into the traffic because he's so busy talking about gaming. However, he makes me feel that I'm okay because everybody assumes that on the outside I look okay, but I know and he knows that I'm autistic like him. To have somebody understand that I really find it difficult to communicate when he puts no pressure on me whatsoever to communicate. I can say as little or as much as I want to, and that's okay because he accepts me for who I am. And that was really quite an insight, because to an autistic young man who appears as if he's very able to blend in with society compared to his friend who is Asperger's, knowing that he could be with that person and not have to be anybody but himself was a huge magnet. And yet the most, anybody looking at a room would be going, not that guy. So it was really quite interesting because the pressure that we feel we're under to communicate surely adds to the level of anxieties, doesn't it? If we're then having to think about social cues and
that's just reminded me of my quote from my wonderful young man. I asked him about this, and I said, think about friends, think about friendships, and he said to me, autistic people usually don't like to open up about themselves, but when they become friends with someone, they can get very excited and open up too much.
Yeah.
And I just love that, because I remember times when I'm observing as a parent, like maybe you've organized a play date and you've got somebody coming round for tea, as you do as a mum, when they're young, trying to engender these little friendships. And I knew if it was going to work or not by how animated and chatty he was, because there were very clear people who, he was just off with it and couldn't stop talking. And, and it would be really great to see. But then other times where he just, didn't really have much to say. And that person might well have thought, oh, he's really boring. But it was just about that connection. And I think that's something else that is quite tricky to articulate, is that it's about the energy of somebody as well, which is another social cue. You get a vibe, you get a feeling about somebody if you're gonna be okay together or not. And it's trusting those instincts, because I think we can be very aware that way, and it is as well about the sort of the style of somebody. If they are very good at masking, which is, as we know, virulent in the certainly in the secondary school environment, lots of autistic and ADHD teenagers masking all the time, then you can perhaps portray yourself in a certain way that isn't it's a disconnect between what's actually going on the inside. But I could give lots more quotes, but I think we're running out of time a little bit.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I had a mum who told me in assessment that her daughter in the very first year at school used to badger her all the way to school and all the way back from school to hurry up, mummy, so we could walk with my friend. Anyway, the two mums got together and realized that each child was saying the same thing. So they made an effort, a concerted effort, to get these two little girls to walk together all the way to school and all the way from school. Imagine both mums surprised that when they started to do this, thinking their two little girls would be yap, 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 yap all the way there, all the way back, were mute.
Yeah.
But I just thought, there's something about each of you that you obviously connect, but you just don't know what to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also that expectation of the parents, perhaps, as well. Perhaps those little girls are just very painfully aware that here's the mums following behind, waiting for them to speak, and will they actually speak? That's an expectation. But we digress. We need to move on, I think.
We do. Right. So I've got down here another inspirational quote that you had from Chris Packham. I'm not quite sure which this one's about, but
yes, I think it's this one. It's him relating back to when he was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he learned to speak without saying anything. and I just loved that, because that is small talk. I mean, Chris can very, very happily get in touch with me and correct me if I'm wrong. But, that's what I take from that is, we do learn over time the art of small talk.
Yeah.
And I think when you're with your neuro kin, that you realize you don't need the small talk quite quickly, and you can just bypass it. Yeah. However, with neurotypical conversations, certainly, in the general daily run of things, you need to master that art of small talk and just get on with it. I mean, he did say quite a few times, that he was aware that he was, not very interesting, and that he did wear a mask a lot of the time. He just pretended to be something that he wasn't. And I think that is that comes about from feeling like an outcast, which sadly does happen sometimes at school. If somebody's been humiliated, or somebody's been singled out, teachers have a great skill at that at times, of being really, really inappropriate and singling out a young person, and then that can be forever damaging, very hard to move on from. The bossy types, for example, stop being bossy, when actually that little person might well be just trying to be assertive and manage her anxiety.
Yeah. Somebody just absolutely fallen over themselves with laughter when you made the Boris joke. Somebody has also said, I see the voice goes louder and louder, and they get accused of being aggressive and angry, but I just see it as though they are being passionate. Such a good point, isn't it? But also that most people just don't get it. So yes, sure.
Very, very enthusiastic. Like my boy said, if you get on the right topic, you can't shut him up. He can talk forever about certain things. And you do learn in time. You can see the sort of lights go out of the person that you're talking to. You can learn to pick up on cues, but it takes practice, and And what we as parents all we can do is just to say, you will get there. It does change in time, it does get a bit easier. You just have to keep trying,
Yeah. So this brings us on nicely to thinking about anxiety, because of course, much of this generates anxiety in volumes, doesn't it? Bucket loads. So yes, and we've got spoons added to this one. So you're going to have to explain that one for me.
Yeah, well, time is short, but basically,
time is short.
Expectations are usually behind the anxiety. If you're in a set situation, then the expectations are fitting of that situation, and it can be a pressure, that as we know can really build up. And anxiety is an undercurrent anyway, whether you're socially anxious or not. And sadly, a lot of our young people have general anxiety as well as social anxiety, and it can just become one big ball of anxiety, I think, in a situation where you're not feeling at home. Perhaps you're not actually at home, perhaps you are in school or out on the playground, and it's hard to know how to respond in that situation, because the brain can just stop functioning. If you go into that stress response cycle of escalation, you might get very hot around the collar and flare up and become quite agitated, like that viewer put. It can be very, very stressful, and the consciousness becomes super inflated. I think we can become almost hyper aware of our feelings, because it feels so strong. And I enjoyed reading this book by Libby Scott, Can You See Me? I'm getting it in because I think we're going to run out of time to do it a bit later. I know we're supposed to come to this, but Libby Scott herself is autistic, and she wrote this while really young. She's still very young, but yeah, she wrote this a few years ago. When I'm stuck in a bad thought or feeling, it's like the whole world is grey, and I'm almost trapped in a body that's not my own, that feels very uncomfortable, which just makes me want to cry. And then I give off all this negative body language, and it can be really difficult. And she says she can be stuck in that feeling. I'm just paraphrasing now. And then she said she can get hangry. Bear with me. Thangry or tangry, which makes it all even worse. And of course, hangry is when you're hungry. Thangry if you're perhaps thirsty. Tangry if you're really tired. So it can be the influence on your energy, and that's why I've put spoons, because there's lots of autistic people that talk about spoon energy, how many spoons that you start the day with, and that it's a measurement of energy, and that certain activities, especially social activities, can use up an awful lot of spoons, and then you end up depleted. I found this in Tony Attwood's book that's aimed at Aspergers young people. Despite the lack of innate hardwiring for easy socializing, many people with Aspergers or autism can utilize their intellect to achieve social inclusion, but the psychological cost is high. The mental effort of intellectually analyzing every interaction to know what to do and how to say is exhausting. Yeah. And for every hour spent socializing, will need an hour of solitude afterwards to recharge those energy levels.
Yeah.
And long-term anxiety can lead to really low mood, of course, as well. And it is useful, I think, to picture spoons. It's certainly been useful for me. It's maybe not useful for everybody, but it's something to look up. You know, there have been lots of autistic advocates talking about spoons. So yeah, it all sort of conspires to make communication and interactions even more difficult.
I like the fact that Tony has identified for every hour it's another hour, because I know that when I've been writing reports, I've had to express, particularly when it gets transferred across to the initial screening and an EHCP, about you have to allow 4 times the length, because there is so much more than just a straightforward you talk, I talk, you talk, I listen. You know, it's so intense, isn't it, with having to think about everything that's being said. And if you find that you don't like socializing, then it's probably down to a lot of it being around. It is so utterly exhausting, all of that, having to think about it, and it causes so much anxiety. Is it really worth it in the end? Or is it just, you know, we just have to just resign ourselves to the fact that actually, you know, it's better for our mental health and well-being just to keep it minimalistic pretty much most of the time. We're running out of time. We have a choice. We can talk about something very quickly, or we can kind of just wrap it up and just think about what we're going to be looking at next week. What would you like to do?
Oh goodness, you put me on the spot.
Have I really?
Yes, I think, yeah, we can think about wrapping up. I'm just wondering about if I can find one of my quotes.
Oh, one of your quotes. Well, for now, I'm just going to put this up. As ever, we're extremely grateful to everybody who's been watching. We do hope that these continue to be interesting, food for thought, provoking thoughts. Somebody's been very kind to say thank you so much. This has been fascinating and informative. You know, I really hope that you're going to come back to hear the other bits, because obviously this is such a huge subject area, isn't it? Anyway, have you found your food for thought? Your lovely quote
for the day. And I mean, I've just got so much to try and fit into a couple of bits. It makes my brain explode. This is my ADHD now at full functioning, or not. That, you know, the scattered mind that is me. You know, I totally get it and relate. And you know, this is the thing about us presenting this program, the very art of doing chats communication, isn't it? And I think, you know, if there's just one thing to get across to our community, is that, you know, we do this in order to spread the word and to help engage thought, and to think about things that you might not necessarily have thought about before. And I think, you know, as ever, I like to think about something positive, in that, you know, our young people are developing and growing and changing all the time. And if your particular young person is having a difficult time at the moment with friendships, we absolutely get it. You know, it can be so difficult in how to approach that, you know, that they've maybe had a really bad falling out, or you know, they're perhaps feeling really lonely and they haven't got much by way of friendships, and to just keep looking, you know, keep open. And I will attach, as ever, for the YouTube channel, I do attach references and things to, and send them to Yasmin to put at the footnote, which, you know, will have links and things such as the podcasts. and the books.
Great. I think out of everything we've talked about today, my summation is the minefield. The minefield of navigation, because it just kind of reiterates how arduous, how tough and challenging it can be for us. That's all we have time for today, everybody. We are hugely grateful as ever, Sue, to you. Thank you so much for looking up so much information, and it's been a really interesting journey so far. Like I said right at the beginning, there is part 2 for this next week, so do join us next Wednesday at 12:15. Take care. Bye bye for now.
Thank you. Bye bye.